Get started. Welcome to MTSO. I'm Kathy Dixon, and I facilitate the Theological Commons, the program that brings you tonight's lecture. The Theological Commons at MTSO sets out to bridge the theological scholarship and conversation happening on our campus with the broader community. A full lineup of our spring programming is under the Events tab on our website. Had to put that plug in there. But we are pleased this evening that Dr. Yvonne Zimmerman will deliver our first faculty lecture of the semester. And I invite our academic dean, Dr. Lisa Withrow, to introduce her.
Good evening, everyone. I'm glad you could come out on a cold, not quite snowy night. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Yvonne Zimmerman, who comes to us this evening as the Associate Professor in Christian Ethics, having earned her PhD in Religious and Theological Studies at the University of Denver and Iliff School of Theology in 2008. And then we got her right after that, which was great. She studied Christianity and Culture as her Master's of Theological Studies at Candler School of Theology. Her first published book is titled Other Dreams of Freedom, Religion, Sex, and Human Trafficking, published in 2012. She also has a book chapter forthcoming in the Routledge Companion to Human Trafficking titled Disrupting Religious Privilege, Code of Conduct for Religious Institutions, Faith Communities, and Faith-Based Organizations for their work with survivors of forced labor, human trafficking, and modern slavery. An additional chapter will appear this fall titled Forced Labor and the Movement to End Human Trafficking in the Companion to Public Theology. She has authored numerous articles in her field and web-based publications. She is in demand as both a public keynote speaker and an invited guest speaker at universities, and as I calculate it, usually at a rate of 2 to 5 presentations, major presentations per year. She also contributes to the field as a leader in her academic guilds as presenter at the Society of Christian Ethics, where she is co-chair of the Ethics and Sexualities Working Group, and the American Academy of Religion, where she is a steering committee member of the Queer Studies in Religion group. Perhaps some influences that have directed Dr. Zimmerman to her current academic discipline and work in the field include these things, not on her CV. Dr. Zimmerman was a caseworker at the Center for Community Justice in Elkhart, Indiana, the oldest restorative justice organization in the U.S. She also coordinated volunteer services at the DeKalb Rape Crisis Center in Decatur, Georgia, a year before she launched into her doctoral program. I know I am delighted, and we are all delighted to have Yvonne Zimmerman on this faculty with her incisive thought and attention to ethics as we make institutional decisions. She also has changed the lives of many students with her social justice focus and her fine academic work. I present to you Dr. Yvonne Zimmerman.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you, Dean Withrow, for the introduction. I am grateful to you and to the Theological Commons for the invitation to give this faculty lecture. I am also thankful for everybody who came out on this cold, snowy, or sort of slushy evening, because it is the time of year when I feel, anyway, that at home and in pajamas always has its own appeal that kind of outweighs just about everything. It is good to see some familiar faces, faculty and other colleagues, some former colleagues, friends, students, and I also understand that there are some prospective students who are still here from some scholarship interviews that you all were doing earlier today and this week. So I hope you've had a good couple of days on campus exploring this place, meeting students, talking with faculty, and getting a feel of the intellectual life of this place. I'm sure lots of people have said it to you already, but let me just add my voice and say that MTSO is a really amazing place to be. I've been researching and writing about the topic of human trafficking for over a decade now. And in fact, what I'm going to talk about this evening is not actually my newest research. Some of you may know that I am on a semester-long sabbatical right now. Today marks week 3. So I plan to discuss, not that I'm counting, so my plan is to discuss some of the background that's the foundation for the project I'm currently working on during my research leave. My interest in the topic of human trafficking is actually in the social movement to end it. In particular, I'm interested in how, why, and through what strategies and actions people, especially Christians, are working to end trafficking in persons. So people talk about human trafficking in a lot of ways, and sometimes they mean different things by the term. So when I use this term, I use it to talk about the problem of severe labor exploitation. In other words, situations in which people have lost control of their lives such that they are paid nothing or next to nothing for their work and are not able to leave their situation without fear of violence. The term human trafficking means a person does not have control over the terms and conditions of their employment when the people or group for whom they are working has all the control and they can't just walk away or quit without fear that they or somebody they care about won't be targeted for physical harm as a result. So when I talk about human trafficking, this is what I mean. One of the reasons that human trafficking and the movement to end it interest me as an ethicist is that there is actually very little sustained moral and ethical reflection on the topic of human trafficking. Sure, people talk a lot and very passionately about human trafficking. But feeling passionate about human trafficking isn't necessarily the same thing as understanding it. Talking a lot about a topic, even something serious like human trafficking, is not the same as asking thoughtful, well-framed questions about it. Unfortunately, this is easy to forget. It's as if because people feel so strongly that trafficking is wrong, that anything anyone does to oppose it is therefore automatically a good thing. As an ethicist, it's my job to trouble that assumption, to insist that questions about what human trafficking is, why it is wrong, and what strategies most effectively curtail it can't just be skipped over as if they don't matter. These questions do matter. They matter because the way that moral issues are presented is important. The framing of moral issues, the words that are used, the images that are invoked, the stories that are told, all of these things subtly shape how people understand that issue. And the way that people understand a moral issue shape the solutions that they'll devise to address it. So how moral issues are presented, framed, and understood matters. How the issue of human trafficking is presented, understood, and framed matters. Our understanding of what human trafficking is and why it is wrong directly shapes the remedies that activists and advocates, people like yourselves, will support. So thinking carefully about human trafficking and becoming aware of how this issue is framed and the assumptions that are at work in this framing are crucial to sound ethical analysis and advocacy. One of the primary questions that I've been working on the past couple of years is this: does progressive Christianity have anything distinct theologically or unique ethically and morally to bring to the issue of human trafficking or to anti-human trafficking activism and advocacy? So first, let me explain what I mean by progressive Christianity. There's a variety of ways to talk about this term, and it's possible to highlight different features of what might be sort of progressive Christianity's essential traits. So the working definition of progressive Christianity that I'm going to use is that progressive Christianity refers to a loose set of traditions of Christian identity and practice that are rooted in what the late feminist social ethicist Beverly Harrison called a theological vision of the world where there are no excluded ones. Many Christian theologies are rooted in principled exclusions: who's in and who's out, saints and sinners, the saved and the damned. What marks progressive Christianity as unique is its inclusive way of approaching Christianity. No excluded ones. In the most basic terms, progressive Christianity says we're all in. Now, my question that I've been working with is partly a rhetorical one, because progressive Christians aren't exactly new to the issue of human trafficking. Progressive Christians are involved in the anti-trafficking movement. At the same time, progressive Christian anti-trafficking activism and advocacy as such isn't really a thing. What I mean by that is that most of the time when what progressive Christians say and do about human trafficking is pretty identical to what other Christians are saying and doing about it. And this strikes me as a missed opportunity because I think that progressive Christianity's theological vision has some important contributions to make to the movement to end human trafficking. Over the years that I've been studying the anti-trafficking movement, one of the things that I've noticed is the shape-shifting that takes place when progressive Christians take up this issue. By shape-shift, I mean that when progressive Christians join the movement to end human trafficking, they regularly and predictably abandon the unique theological and moral perspectives that makes their social engagement distinctive. The social analyses they use cede to the way that trafficking is usually understood, the way it is usually depicted, and the way it's usually addressed. What I'm getting at is that frequently I see progressives using the same stories and images and supporting the same basic approaches to conceptualizing and remedying human trafficking as the rest of the movement. This is what I mean when I say that progressive Christians shapeshift. They just blend in with the rest of the movement. Their perspectives and voices are indistinguishable from what everyone else who opposes human trafficking is saying and doing. When progressives get involved in the issue of trafficking, what they're doing and saying becomes pretty identical to the conservative and evangelical Christian religious voices that define the movement. Like chameleons, they just blend right in and disappear. So on the issue of human trafficking, progressive Christians are missing in action. Let me give you 2 examples. The month of January is Human Trafficking Awareness Month, and January 11th is Human Trafficking Awareness Day. All month long, Americans are encouraged to plan educational events, to demonstrate support for anti-trafficking legislation, to back law enforcement efforts, and to pledge financial or volunteer support to various anti-trafficking groups. Several years ago, one of the many promotional emails for Human Trafficking Awareness Day that I received began with a fairly standard description of human trafficking. I'm going to read it because I know that that's like just about impossible for you to read. I can't get it any bigger. It read, "Human trafficking, referred to as modern-day slavery, is the fastest growing and second most profitable criminal industry in the world. More than 27 million women, men, and children have become victims of human trafficking for forced labor and sexual exploitation. Trafficking can and does occur in all parts of the world, including the U.S. Large sporting events like the Super Bowl attract human trafficking, especially for sexual exploitation of women." End quote. The email also included a section entitled Stories of Human Trafficking from the Polaris Project website. 4 of the featured vignettes have to do with some form of exploitative commercial sex. You can see that the one vignette that is not about sex falls third in the sequence, sandwiched between, so it's right in the middle, sandwiched between the 2 sexual vignettes that precede it and the 2 that follow it. This depiction of human trafficking as sold sex is a pretty standard framing. Evocative metaphors like female sexual slavery, modern-day slavery, and rape for profit that call to mind the shameful legacy of chattel slavery at the same time as they emphasize sexual exploitation are commonly used tropes for characterizing the range of human rights violations associated with forced labor. Because trafficking is frequently depicted in this way, when people hear the term human trafficking, they're more likely to envision a young woman controlled by a pimp or who works in a brothel somewhere like Thailand or India, than they are to visualize a person who works in a meatpacking plant in Iowa or Nebraska, someone who picks tomatoes in the fields of North Carolina or Florida, let alone the workers in the production lines of the factories where the cell phones, iPads, and laptops on which we rely to facilitate our daily lives are manufactured. In other words, most people don't think about forced labor generally, but about forced sexual labor specifically. The presentation of human trafficking in the email that I received follows the pattern of sexualizing the issue, the idea that human trafficking is chiefly the commercial sexual exploitation of women and girls. And indeed, the impression that human trafficking means commercial sexual exploitation of women and girls is one that is carefully cultivated, widely circulated, and commonly accepted as true. Now, the email mentioned labor exploitation too, so human trafficking isn't strictly equated with commercial sex, but the prominence of the sexual elements is designed to hook readers' attention, creating the general impression that while human trafficking is sometimes labor exploitation, it is usually and most urgently sexual exploitation. Finally, following the stories of human trafficking, the email ended with a prayer of solidarity. Again, I want to emphasize that the presentation of human trafficking in this email, the statistics and description as modern-day slavery, its depiction in the 5 vignettes, and the concluding prayer of solidarity, none of this is unusual. As someone who studies the movement to end trafficking, there was nothing extraordinary or surprising to me about either how the problem of trafficking was presented or about how people were summoned to respond to it. On my read, it could have been sent by any range of Christian anti-trafficking organizations, the Salvation Army, International Justice Mission, or even by a local church. However, what ended up catching my attention about this email was precisely the organization that sent it. It wasn't sent by one of the organizations I might have expected, but it was from the Women's Alliance for Theology, Ethics, and Ritual. It goes by the acronym WATER. WATER is a feminist Catholic organization, one of the most progressive Christian feminist social justice organizations in the United States, and I want to be very clear, this is an organization for which I have a great deal of respect. The Human Trafficking Awareness Day email from WATER really drove home to me how morally shallow many common condemnations of human trafficking really are. Even a casual observer can see that sex trafficking is something that Americans love to hate. In condemning sex trafficking, we feel principled. There is something about standing with firm moral clarity about sex trafficking that is deeply morally gratifying and emotionally satisfying. I think it's important to connect this sense of moral gratification with Christians' long history of sexual obsession. When to have it, with whom, under what conditions, and for what kinds of purposes. Sex is easily framed as a moral issue, as the quintessential moral issue. What's more, Christians have learned to insist on moral justification for sex in ways that are quite distinct from other domains of life that are also connected to morality. Let's think about the contrast with work. In U.S. American culture, there is a general expectation that adults should occupy themselves with some sort of labor, whether paid, like in a job, or unpaid, as a student, parent, or other caretaker, and that they will do so even if this work is harmful to their bodies, emotionally unsatisfying, or interferes to some extent with family and other obligations. Hard work is an American value. It's something that we feel is intrinsically good in itself. At the same time, Americans are fairly ambivalent about undercompensated work. For instance, as evidenced by our lack of collective outrage about a national minimum wage that falls well below the amount necessary to sustain an individual at a dignified standard of living, let alone a family. In part, this is because hard work is culturally understood as essential to the formation of moral character in ways that far exceed one's hourly wage. Americans believe that work forms individuals into decent people, mature and responsible citizens. Rarely do we question when, with whom, and under what conditions or for what purposes people should work. Work as such seems to require moral justification only under the rarest of circumstances. Far more typically, the moral burden is placed on those who would be socially exempted from paid labor, for instance, to qualify for disability, or on those who rely on some other form of public assistance. We treat sex very differently. Sex is everywhere and always morally burdened. It is difficult to discuss sex publicly without some accompanying judgment about whether the sex in question is good or bad, right or wrong, sanctioned or forbidden, we are constantly told that clear, distinct lines differentiating good and bad sex are urgently needed because social order, civilization as we know it, depends on them, an idea that Gail Rubin called the domino theory of sexual peril. So tightly are sex and morality intertwined that referencing one of this pair is generally sufficient to also conjure the other. Culturally and religiously alike, Americans tend not to see sex as innocent until proven guilty, but the reverse, as guilty until proven innocent. Ways that sexual activity is typically proven innocent include love, commitment, or marriage. Satisfying none of these general conditions for exonerating sexual activity, commercial sex and prostitution are widely condemned as immoral, as bad sex. Many people consider commercial sex a clear and legitimate target of moral condemnation. Morally, many Christians have no problem either joining in or leading the condemnatory refrain, impugning both the people who buy it and the people who sell it. Because human trafficking is so closely identified with prostitution in many people's minds, it's easy to assume that sex trafficking is wrong for essentially the same reasons. It's sex disconnected from any of the conditions that morally absolve it. Just in the case of trafficking, the separation is writ large or taken to the extreme. This is a flawed analysis. Human trafficking is wrong, no doubt, but it's not the failure to satisfy the criteria for morally permissible sex, love, commitment, or marriage that makes it so. If human trafficking is an umbrella term that refers to the wide variety of processes by which individuals lose control over their lives such that they're forced to work for nothing or next to nothing and are unable to leave a situation without fear of violence, then it's not sex that makes human trafficking a moral problem. Human trafficking is wrong because people are not paid fairly or adequately for the work that they do, including sometimes sex work, and because they can't leave their situation without fear that they or someone they care about won't be targeted for physical harm as a result. The idea that bad sex or sexual immorality is the fundamental moral problem of human trafficking is a mistake that I see repeated constantly as I study the movement to end human trafficking, and even by people and groups who I respect. I think that one of the reasons this mistake continues to be repeated is, as I've already mentioned, that condemning sex trafficking is so emotionally satisfying and morally gratifying. It feels like moral clarity. Another reason is how morally easy it is to denounce commercial sex. For most earnest Americans who spend, or who are in school preparing to spend, 40-plus hours a week actively participating in the formal labor market and who never have, and likely never will, pay for sex in a direct fee-for-service transaction, obsessively condemning sex trafficking requires far less of them than squarely facing the immorality of the global economy. Condemnation of commercial sex is much easier than serious and sustained critique of the global economic system in which, I dare to guess, all of us in this room participate and from which we benefit. Announcing opposition to sex trafficking does not require most of us to change or frankly even really question the practical arrangements of our own moral commitments. Conveniently, it allows us to point the finger elsewhere, at people other than ourselves. Progressive Christianity has a rich history of critiquing neoliberal global capitalism, so it is well poised to address the systemic issues of economic exploitation and social inequality that are at the root of human trafficking. Yet too often, progressive Christians succumb to the seductions of the dominant anti-trafficking narrative. Thus, a progressive Christian organization like Water that produces extremely insightful and forward-thinking analyses of other moral issues falls back on the dominant anti-trafficking narrative of sold sex and touts the same political measures for ending human trafficking as the mainstream anti-trafficking movement. The irony is that this is an organization that I would expect to be challenging the dominant framing of the issue, not capitulating to it by embracing its terms. A second example clarifies still further what I'm getting at. A little over 4 years ago, in the fall of 2011, a group of progressive religious leaders, rabbis, pastors, bishops, and imams, joined a campaign in the greater New York City area to shut down the adult services section of the popular classified advertising website Backpage.com. Some of you might remember this, especially since Backpage continues to still be in the media from time to time. The campaign emerged in response to concerns about the website being used to arrange commercial sex, including, in the words of the campaign, quote, the sale of children. Working through a social action and initiative of the Auburn Theological Seminary in New York called Groundswell, the group of religious leaders took out a full-page advertisement in the New York Times where they published an open letter to Village Voice Media, which is the parent company of Backpage.com. As with Waters' Human Trafficking Awareness Day email, it is the framing of human trafficking as a moral issue, what it is, why it's wrong, and what needs to be done to stop it in this open letter to which I want to draw your attention. Again, I know that you can't actually read that. The letter speaks in a voice of unflinching moral clarity, opening with the declaration, quote, it is a basic fact of the moral universe that boys and girls should not be sold for sex. So we were surprised and stunned, the letter continues, to realize that Village Voice Media continues to publish an adult section on the classified website Backpage.com that has been used as a platform for the trafficking of minors, end quote. As is common across other similar anti-trafficking initiatives, the letter emphasizes the broad moral consensus condemning human trafficking, here referred to as a consensus that is shared by, quote, moral and religious leaders of many creeds and backgrounds, and gestures towards Village Voice Media's own corporate stakes in this consensus, stating, quote, we trust that your company shares our outrage over the sex trafficking of minors and trust that you are committed to running your business without compromising the lives of our nation's boys and girls, end quote. Like Waters' email, there is considerable slippage between the broad term trafficking and the group's specific concern, which is sex trafficking. The letter's rhetoric of, quote, being sold for sex conflates sex trafficking and with commercial sex work generally, implying that these are indistinguishable. The crux of the argument is that there is no reliable way to distinguish between prostitution and sex trafficking, and this claim anchors the call to action with which the letter concludes. Quote, we can do something right now to help these boys and girls. Please shut down the adult section of Backpage.com immediately so that no minor is exploited through advertisements on your website, end quote. Groundswell's open letter and accompanying media campaign created a bit of a stir, attracting the attention not only of Village Voice Media, but also of the broader news media and the public. Several months after the letter was published, representatives from Village Voice Media agreed to meet with clergy at Auburn Theological Seminary, and in the spring of 2012, Groundswell delivered to Village Voice Media's offices a petition demanding the closure of the adult services section of Backpage.com that was signed by more than 600 faith leaders and over 250,000 community members. So the public was engaged, and by this measure, the campaign could be deemed a success. Yet there is a sense in which I think the campaign's success is not so clear-cut. For instance, the executive editor of Village Voice Media, Michael Lacey, boasted sarcastically to a New York Times reporter, we have all these practicing politicians and concerned clergy after us, so we must be doing something, right? Now, Lacey's remark is dismissive and clearly rather patronizing, but I think it's also very telling. It tells us that, on the whole, the campaign's message and the values that animated it failed rather spectacularly to connect with the constituents in the way that the organizers at Groundswell had hoped. As background here, I think it's important to keep in mind the way that, at least since the emergence of the moral majority and the Christian right as political forces during the 1970s, conservative social movements have developed a habit of using Christian theology as a key public vocabulary. For instance, it is common for conservative Christian theology to be invoked as justification for hallmark conservative political strategies like defending gender inequality in the workplace, limiting women's reproductive rights, and refusing to recognize the civil rights of LGBTQ and gender nonconforming people. In fact, Christian theological arguments have been offered as public rationale for conservative social policies that enact gender and sexual regulation so frequently, so repetitively, that Americans have learned to expect conservative social movements to explain themselves in Christian terms. What, unfortunately, Americans have also learned in this process is to equate and conflate conservative and Christian. That is, to assume that Christian advocacy on public issues must automatically mean support for conservative values and policies. Lacey's words reflect such an expectation. His comment presumes that a letter from clergy and religious leaders on the subject of commercial sex must be speaking not just from the perspective of, but also in defense of, social conservatism. He seems to presume, in other words, that since the letter is signed by religious leaders, that sexual regulation and limiting free speech must be the real agenda of the Groundswell campaign. So let's take a look at Groundswell to see if this was the case. Groundswell, as I've said, is a social action initiative of Auburn Theological Seminary. It works on a wide range of social issues, including domestic violence, gender justice, immigration, prison reentry, healthcare access, and the concerns of LGBTIQ people from a distinctly religious, progressive religious perspective. In fact, Groundswell's website describes the Backpage campaign with specific reference to these commitments. Their website explains, quote, "Child sex slavery is rooted in nearly every other social injustice. If you care about ending poverty, homelessness, human trafficking, immigrant exploitation, LGBT oppression, racism, and violence against girls, this is your call to action. This is not a conservative issue or a liberal issue. This is about ending an unconscionable practice." The organizers of the Groundswell campaign saw connections between sex trafficking of minors and many of these broader systemic issues. The open letter reflects the systemic perspective by identifying poverty and abuse as root causes of child sex trafficking. Further, the writers acknowledge that eliminating adult ads from online classified websites is but one step, and ending the sex trafficking of minors requires connecting the dots between many interconnected pieces. In other words, the Groundswell campaign was not a moralistic crusade against sexual immorality. Its concern wasn't sex per se, as much as it was about curbing violence and abuse against children and young people. Groundswell's campaign to shut down Backpage's adult services section was rooted in progressive Christian values and religious commitments. It was not aligned religiously with conservative Christianity or politically with the right. To the contrary, the group's objective was to highlight the systemic inequalities and social justice issues connected to the commercial sex industry, particularly as pertains to minors. But Lacey, and hence Village Voice Media and its supporters, didn't see that. They heard religious language, Christian theological language, and drew the conclusion that the campaign was rooted in a moralistic sexual conservatism and sought to promote conservative perspectives, values, and goals. That is to say, they completely misidentified the political grounding of the Groundswell campaign. The progressive social values that animated Groundswell's work failed to register as anything distinct from the usual conservative role of religious voices in public discourse. Water's Human Trafficking Awareness Day email and the Groundswell campaign to shut down the adult services section of Backpage.com are but two examples. Yet I think these progressive forays into anti-trafficking activism help to clarify several things. The first thing that they clarify is the broader observation that, for the most part, there is nothing distinctive about the way progressive Christians approach human trafficking. By and large, they rely on the same images of sexual exploitation and sexual slavery. They tell the same kind of patronizing rescue stories, and they tout the same anti-trafficking strategies that center on abolishing prostitution as the rest of the mainstream anti-trafficking movement. Whatever is distinctively progressive about the ways that progressive Christians engage human trafficking isn't being communicated effectively. It's missing in action. The second thing these examples clarify is the strength and even intractability of the dominant conceptual framework for understanding human trafficking, namely as sold sex. It is extremely difficult for groups to remain socially legible as genuinely against or opposed to human trafficking without invoking the specter of sold sex and sexual slavery. Now, without a doubt, there is a delicate balance here, because to assume that everyone who sells sex has full agency doesn't do enough to protect those who don't, whose agency is limited such that they are victims of trafficking. Some people who sell sex do not wish to do so, and no one should be forced, whether by an individual or by circumstance, to sell sex for money or trade it for any other items of value like food, transportation, or a place to sleep. Forced labor of any kind is wrong. At the same time, people report widely varying experiences with selling sex. Selling sexual services is not an experience of victimization for everyone. I believe there is a moral obligation to believe and affirm people's positive experiences every bit as much as their negative ones. My view is that everyone who sells sex is entitled to fair compensation, to safe working conditions, and to dignity and respect, because these are rights to which all people are entitled and that no one has to earn. Furthermore, those who wish to leave the sex industry should have the opportunities to do so, including access to the support and resources to make that transition successfully. In other words, there's no such thing as the perfect position statement on the relationship between sex work and trafficking that will hold true in every conceivable circumstance. The challenge, rather, is to be able to hear and respond to people's experiences, whatever they are. However, a big problem, as I see it, is that the most readily available framework for understanding human trafficking predetermines the meaning of commercial sex as exploitation and abuse. In other words, it understands commercial sex as automatically sex trafficking. And because sex trafficking is something that Americans love to hate, many organizations' constituents are happy to embrace this perspective. When in turn, progressive Christians incorporate this same framework into their activism and advocacy, it's actually not especially surprising, even if it is disappointing or frustrating. Articulating an anti-trafficking perspective that does not conflate commercial sex and human trafficking, and that refuses sensationalist images and rhetoric, while at the same time unequivocally condemning forced labor, is a formidable challenge. This brings me back to my original question. Does progressive Christianity have a distinct perspective on human trafficking? Does it have anything unique to say theologically or to bring ethically and morally to anti-trafficking activism and advocacy? Progressive Christians have long been vocal critics of the economic arrangements, practices, and consequences of neoliberal global capitalism, so my answer is a resounding yes. Progressive Christianity has resources that I believe are well suited for the task of thinking through what a different anti-trafficking framework might look like and how it might function. In particular, progressive Christianity's history of critiquing neoliberal global capitalism positions it well to highlight the systemic issues of economic exploitation and social inequality that are at the root of trafficking, whether for sex, labor, or as anthropologist Denise Brennan's research on people in the US who have experienced trafficking indicates is most common, some combination of both. Yet there is a real gap, a marked disconnection between these critiques of neoliberal capitalism on the one hand and the ways progressives often approach human trafficking on the other hand. That is to say, the insights that progressive Christian critiques of neoliberal global capitalism yield are often disarticulated in the ways that progressive Christians approach human trafficking. My argument is that these things need to be thought together. Now, as a review for those of you who might need it, neoliberalism is a political economic theory within capitalism that aims at economic growth and efficiency as primary social and political goals. According to neoliberal economic theory, unregulated or free markets are the most efficient and reliable means to achieve economic growth, and free markets are uniquely capable of reaching the best, most efficient solutions to complex social problems. So neoliberalism not only posits the free market as basic to economic growth, but to social and political goods like individual liberties, human rights, environmental protections, and so on as well. In neoliberal terms, political and social goods are above all derivatives of economic growth, inseparable from, if not identical to, economic prosperity and efficiency. Likely many of you are aware that neoliberalism influences economic policy and political practice alike in the US. Those of you who have studied the effects of globalization, structural adjustment policies, or the trend of outsourcing or privatizing public services may be familiar with the ways that neoliberalism exacerbates many of the conditions that cause human trafficking. Thus understood, human trafficking is not an isolated aberration in the way the global economy functions, but a perfectly predictable outcome of the routine workings of neoliberal global capitalism. What is often given less thoughtful attention, however, is how neoliberalism also shapes the movement to end human trafficking. For instance, the wide endorsement of harsh criminal penalties, including increasingly long prison sentences for those convicted of trafficking offenses, the enthusiastic push to integrate formerly trafficked people into the free market through formal wage labor, and the promotion of heteronormative nuclear families as the crowning achievement of personal autonomy and symbol of freedom from violence and abuse. Each of these common anti-trafficking strategies reflects neoliberal capitalist logic, an argument that Letitia Campbell and I explore at length in our co-authored work. Consider Kevin Bales, widely considered a leading expert on human trafficking and forced labor. He explicitly invokes the neoliberal capitalist economy as an agent of freedom from trafficking, arguing in his book, Understanding Global Slavery, quote, "Freed slaves become what a slave can never be, a consumer." Notice the articulation of freedom in terms of purchasing power, the ability to buy things, control of one's life as evidenced by the ability to consume as an economic identity. And it's not just Bales. A staff member of the International Justice Mission, IJM, which is the largest evangelical anti-trafficking organization in the world, offered a similar rationale for IJM's anti-trafficking work, stating, quote, "Our real goal is to bring people out of slavery into the free market," end quote. Here, the market is positioned as essential to, if not constitutive of, freedom from trafficking. In other words, freedom from human trafficking entails integration as workers and consumers in the free market. Another way the anti-trafficking movement is shaped by neoliberal assumptions is how the state's role is understood. For example, we are constantly told that the best and most effective way for the state to fight human trafficking is through passing tougher anti-trafficking laws and legislating harsh criminal penalties to punish individuals convicted of trafficking offenses. Here in Ohio, for example, a felony human trafficking conviction carries a mandatory minimum sentence of 10 years. The message is not only that these measures are the best way for the state to contribute to curbing the violations and harms of human trafficking, but really that these are the only meaningful ways that it can do so. One form of this tough on crime, law and order approach, one form that it takes on the ground, is, in the name of cracking down on human trafficking, expanding the prerogatives of law enforcement to detain people on suspicion of prostitution. Now, I know that to some this might sound like a good thing, getting people who sell sex off the streets and the possibility of rescuing some trafficking victims in the process. But what does this actually look like in practice? For one, the way many of these initiatives are carried out is fraught with racial bias, specifically targeting people of color who are involved in the street-based sexual economy. Here I have in mind the way that long prison sentences for individuals convicted of human trafficking offenses are most frequently handed down to men of color. This racial bias doesn't start in the courtroom, however, it begins on the street. Stop and frisk is a law enforcement practice in which, on the basis of articulable, reasonable suspicion of criminal activity, police officers may stop an individual for questioning if they have reasonable suspicion that the person may be armed, and if they have reasonable suspicion that the person may be armed, may frisk that individual for weapons. In 2011, 90% of the stop and frisks stops in New York City were of people of color. Transgender and gender nonconforming people of color are often particularly targeted by law enforcement. The National Coalition of Anti-Violence Programs reports that transgender people of color are more than 3 times as likely to experience hate violence from police as compared to the general population. If not stop and frisk, transgender women in particular are often stopped under the pretense of enforcing anti-prostitution and anti-trafficking laws. Trans people of color report that they are frequently targeted by police for arbitrary stops while in the course of conducting their daily routine tasks. What's more, these stops often involve physical, sexual, and verbal assault. In a 2012 study on police violence against lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer people in Queens, New York, 61% of transgender people reported having been harassed by police during a stop. Of that 61%, almost half, 46%, reported that they had also experienced some sort of physical abuse at the hands of law enforcement. While LGBTQ people of all racial categories experience more police stops compared to their straight and cisgender counterparts, the highest rates of harassment and physical abuse during these stops are visited specifically on trans people of color. This is but a single example of how people of color are targeted under the pretext of fighting human trafficking. One of the crucial questions this raises is, as one advocate put it, whether the tactic of targeting street-level prostitution in the name of fighting human trafficking is more successful at providing concrete benefits to trafficking victims or at terrorizing and criminalizing marginalized communities that too often are already treated as legitimate targets of violence. When anti-trafficking efforts leave members of marginalized communities less safe, less protected, when they enjoy fewer civil rights and paradoxically actually become more vulnerable to violence, then I believe that these strategies need to be recognized as failures, as negatively impacting the people and communities they ostensibly aim to protect. Progressive Christianity has long objected to the neoliberal principle that the purpose of the state is to serve the economy, as well as to the neoliberal conception of the state's primary role as an agent of punitive carceral justice. In progressive Christian perspective, the purpose of the state is to serve the common good, and its political role is to act as an agent of economic redistribution and assistance. In relation to human trafficking, this means that the state's primary role is not simply to legislate tougher anti-trafficking laws and lock up more trafficking offenders. It is the role of the state to redress the social and economic structural inequalities that foment human trafficking in the first place. Now, I want to be clear that I am not saying that the criminal justice system has no role to play in ending human trafficking. Rather, I'm pushing back against the idea, the presumption that punitive carceral interventions, law and order solutions, are the best means for dealing with an issue like human trafficking. I know that thinking about human trafficking and mass incarceration together is not a popular pairing, but we must not underestimate the tremendous force at present of the financial incentive to send people to prison. Locking people up in prisons is financially profitable. But no matter how financially profitable the prison industrial complex might be, locking people up does not fix social problems. In truth, the unprecedented scale at which the U.S. incarcerates its citizens is itself a social problem. Mass incarceration is a wholly inadequate strategy for ending human trafficking. So does progressive Christianity have a unique and worthwhile perspective to bring to the issue of human trafficking or to anti-trafficking activism and advocacy? Or what might an anti-trafficking perspective that is intentionally and explicitly rooted in a progressive Christian perspective look like? The kind of analysis to which I am pointing is marked first by the ability to contextualize human trafficking in relation to broader social justice issues, like inadequate wages, lack of safe and affordable public housing, unreliable and inefficient public transportation systems, the exorbitant cost of quality childcare, food insecurity, underfunded public education systems, insufficient public health, addictions and mental health services, failures of the foster care system, to list just a few. We saw this kind of contextualization attempted, if not altogether successfully accomplished, in the Groundswell's campaign against human trafficking. All right, let's catch up. a second mark of the distinctively, you missed some good slides, a second mark of the distinctively progressive Christian anti-trafficking perspective has two parts. First is the ability to identify when anti-trafficking interventions and strategies, no matter how popular they might be, this is not about a popularity contest, you probably figured that out already, are constructed by means of the same neoliberal capitalist logic that progressive Christians blame for stimulating the structural causes of human trafficking. Here I have in mind strategies like, as I've already mentioned, cracking down on prostitution in the name of preventing human trafficking, passing anti-trafficking laws that mandate increasingly long prison sentences, promoting the formation of heteronormative families as the epitome of freedom from trafficking, including when these things are promoted in the name of Christian morality and social justice. The ability to recognize when the institutions of neoliberalism are being waged as ways to end human trafficking is important because if on the one hand we acknowledge that structurally speaking, it's the policies and practices of neoliberal capitalism that are the single most significant set of factors in causing people to lose control of their lives and become caught in trafficking relationships. But then in the next breath, we call on the very institutions that this political economic system produces, embracing them as antidotes to trafficking and suddenly insisting that they can be trusted to bring it to an end. This is a massive contradiction. In the words of Audre Lorde, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. So not only must progressive Christians learn to recognize this contradiction, they must also have the courage and the imagination to resist uncritically embracing neoliberal capitalist logic themselves. In conclusion, these 2 points encapsulate what I see as the crux of progressive Christianity's distinctive theoretical perspective on human trafficking. Progressives lose their distinctive voice on this issue when they capitulate to the logic of neoliberal capitalism. As I said at the outset, the framing of moral issues is important. The words that are used, the images that are invoked, the basic storyline that is presented not only shape the way people understand an issue like trafficking, but the solutions they devise to address it. Sound ethical analysis and advocacy demands careful attention both to the framing of the problem as well as to the process of constructing solutions.